All right, so in this lecture, I'm going to go over how to do some basic breaking stuff in Maya. Um, Obviously, to break stuff, we have to have stuff, so let's make something. Start off simple, we'll do a cube. And we need lots of these to interact dynamically. So if I set this to 0.5, that should set it like right on the ground. And I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to move it over in the X direction 1 unit, and that makes it right next to it. I hit shift, and that hold shift and then hit D a bunch of times. There we go. Grab all these, duplicate it, move it in the Y direction 1.5. Hold down shift, hit D. All right, so now I have 120 some cubes. Okay. So now the way that we break stuff is by using a FX tool plugin called Bullet. Okay, here's all the Bullet stuff. If it's not loaded, you'll go to Settings Preferences, you'll go to Plugin Manager. You will find bullet.mll. Load it, auto-load it, cool beans. For items like this where we have 120 multiple items, we all want to control them the same, we would create a rigid set. Okay, so I go in here, you can call it whatever you want. Wall. There we go. And now if I hit the rewind button, I right click, make sure my playback speed is set to play every frame. Then I hit play, you'll see that it just falls straight down. Now, when we create a bullet, it hides all of our original cubes. That's why they're kind of grayed out still. Typically, I'll group them beforehand, but it works. We'll get a bullet solver, and then we'll get this wall solved, and then we'll get this wall selection group, which is all those other items selected. So I'm going to go into the bullet solver, hit Control A, and I'm going to change a couple things. One, I'm going to say that my internal fixed frame rate is 240. This is just more accurate of a solve. I'm going to say ground plane. That way it'll actually collide with the ground. And we'll just set this aside. Now, every time you change something in Bullet, always hit the rewind button. Never click and drag inside the timeline, and then hit play. Okay. So it was probably super duper subtle. It moved just a hair just to kind of rest. If you don't believe me, there it is. You can still see it kind of. There we go. So it moved. Cool. So it's at rest. So now I'm going to take this. I'm going to make a sphere. Line it up with roughly the center of this. Pull it back. And I'm going to pay attention to the direction. So right now, if I look at my arrows, there we go. Come on. There we go. The blue direction, which is the Z, is negatively facing this, right? So positive would be left, negative is right. So just keep that in mind for a minute. I'm going to go to Bullet. I'm going to go to Create Active Rigid Body. And this is a sphere. So you can pick from different objects in here, but this is a sphere. It's a dynamic body. We'll change everything else later. Everything else is good. Hit apply. Okay, so now again we rewind, we hit play, and what should happen is the ball also falls down and hits the ground. Now what I want to do is I want to launch this ball at the wall. So what I do is I click on it, I go to the attribute editor, and inside here I find initial conditions. Okay, so there's forces and impulses, which is like always be moving this direction. So if I wanted it to rotate, I can change the torque. If I wanted it to impulsively move, I can just type that. That way it's always moving. But if I just want to give it basically a shove, I go to the initial conditions, and this is where I can give that initial velocity. So remember I said we're going in the negative Z. So this is X, this is Y, and this is Z. So I'm going to say negative 30. There we go. And then if I rewind again, I hit play. You'll see that it launches at the wall and then knocks it down. If we rewind it again and see, you'll see that the ball hitting the wall at that spot will change every single time we render this, or every single time we simulate it. There is some subtle variations that will happen. Okay. especially if we start moving stuff. Obviously, that's going to change things drastically because now it's going to hit a different spot and animate differently. Okay, so right now it's kind of hitting in these two areas. If I scoot it over just a hair, now it's going to be hitting the one mainly. And look at that. It like hit it, knocked a couple out, and then it did that. Stupid. All right, so now here's where the fun starts. So, and I don't know why, but these are ridiculously grayed out. It's hard to see, but just pay attention to the words here. So mass obviously is the weight of it. So the heavier this item is, the more impact it's going to have. So not to go too crazy, let's go to 10. Okay, so what happens now is because the ball weighs more, it basically is just like throwing a bowling ball at some foam pieces. It just like flies right through it. Now to go even further, let's go a little bit crazier. Let's say 100. Now see they break even a lot further out because of that mass. So everything dynamic has a mass. This has a mass and this has a mass. This one here, when I click on it, you'll see that it goes to the bullet solver, which is this thing. And then inside there, if I go to the wall initial state, that's where I can change its default mass. So the ball's mass was 100. If I set this one to 100, they'll basically be at the same playing field, and we'll get the same animation-ish that we had when we first started. Okay, so it's all relative to each other as far as what they do. Now, let's leave that back at 1. Watch what happens when it hits. And all these boxes kind of like fly, and if you watch them, they're still kind of like flying and sliding. Okay, so if we want these to feel a little bit more impactful, we just have to know a couple things, definitions. So one of them is damping. So there's linear damping and there's angular damping. So the way that I remember these is linear is kind of like as it's moving, it would just slow itself down. Where angular damping is, let's pretend that we had a ball on a ramp. How much damping or how much resistance would there be for it to start moving downward? Okay, so this is basically like from rest, and this is as it's moving. So if I set this to, not 10, 0.5, and I set this one to 0.5 also. Okay, friction is the stickiness of the ground. So if there's 0 friction, it'll be like an ice rink. It'll just keep sliding forever. Well, it'll have some damping, but it'll pretty much slide. And then if we have it at 1, then it'll be much more sticky surface. And then restitution is a stupid name, but it's like bounciness. So I don't want it to bounce. I just want this to be 0. So it may be hard to see my digits. My mass for the wall is 1. Linear damping is 0.5. Angular is 0.5. Friction is 1. And then restitution is 0. Ignore the fact that these numbers are this for this specific one. Yours may be different. Yours may be higher or lower or whatever. So now we hit play. And you'll see how those cubes come to rest a lot sooner. They're no longer sliding along the ground. And it actually is a bit more impactful as to how they're falling. It feels a little bit more solid than it did a second ago. A second ago it felt more... let's say foam ball-y or foam cubey. And now it feels more like they're blocks, like wooden blocks. Now, that changes these settings for the wall. It doesn't change it for this. So that item there too, I also have linear damping, which is right now it's at 0. So let's set that to 0.5, and angular damping, we'll set that to 0.5. Restitution is already 0, and friction is already up, so that's good. Now, a kind of neat thing that happens here too, because we have damping on this, it's basically going to start to slow the ball down, okay? So before the ball would come in and it would hit probably about here and then fly through, but now that we have damping on, it's actually hitting the ground and then rolling into it. So again, that value that we changed here is going to have a butterfly effect that will change everything. Okay, so then maybe I need to go play with my initial velocity, -60, so I have a little bit more push, so it hits a little bit harder, a little bit faster. Boom, look at that. It's pretty sweet. All right, so now let's see what else we can do, right? So let's take our damping up to like 1, 1. Let's take the wall damping up to 1 on each of these. Some of these will lie, like, you know, it'll say 1 is the most, but sometimes you can type more. I think that's pretty good. All right, so everything's at 1 basically. Oops. And again, rewind and hit play. Look at that. Because the damping is so high up, I guess, on this one, it's 1. There's no movement at all. So I'm really going to have to crank up this initial velocity to maybe negative 500. Nope, it just doesn't want to move at all. All right, let's take the linear damping down to 0.8. Whoop. And then the initial velocity back to negative 60. There you go. So you can see how now it hits this, and the blocks are basically like locked in there. Okay, like they're not moving at all. It just hits and stops. So let's go maybe negative 50. And we'll take this is the ball, by the way, negative 50 on the ball. And we'll take its damping down to 0.5 still. All right, so you can see how the blocks kind of like freeze in time. Okay, so now I'm going to play with the blocks and try to get them to have maybe a little bit more mass. So I set it to 50. And now the ball hits and does this little bump in there. Wind that. Less mass. There we go, that's cool. 10. I want it to bump through a bit. Just ignore that little thing right there. All right, maybe 2. There we go. I don't know what that's doing. Let me just deselect and then play again. Yeah, so you can create some pretty neat stuff here. All right, so now that's using bullet, straight out of the gate bullet, like this, okay? So let me save my scene as. I'm just going to throw this into my default stuff. Bullet dynamics straight. Okay. So now I'm going to make this a different way, because there's different ways to do things, and you get different options based on what you're going to do. So in this one, I'm not going to move this at all. I'm going to go to my mesh, which is again under the plugin manager if you don't see it loaded. And somewhere in here, I think it's actually in its own little node right there. You see mesh. I have a new microphone, and I didn't realize how sensitive it was to picking up me drinking. Okay, so mesh, and then we're going to go to the far left and click on Mesh Network. So mesh is Maya's dynamics or motion stuff. When you do a mesh, your original cube gets hidden. You get this mesh cube, and then you get a mesh node. So on the mesh node, and this may be a little complex at first or confusing at first, but just bear with me. So on the mesh node, you get a mesh, a distribute, and a repro. Ignore the repro for now. We're just going to go to the distribute. Right now we're doing number of points is at 10, and all the distances and scales are all set to 0. So just so you can see it, if I go to Y, and I pull this up, it's duplicating that cube 10 times, and it's offsetting them 12 units. So if I were to set this to 9, one less than the original one, then that would give me 10 cubes stacked on top of each other. Okay. Now, what's neat about this is that I could also change this to, let's say, a grid. And I can just, let's say there's 3, 3, 3. Same thing here, but opposite, I guess. So if I set this to 5, 5, and 5, that's what each of these are. It gives me a little space in between. But if I set them to 6, 6, and 6, then it gives me a solid cube where it's duplicated them and laid them out right next to each other. Now, it's not a huge deal, except when I start to simulate dynamics, if I were to do that and there was a space, it would actually like space out between them, and that would look odd. So that's what we do. All right, now this is another weird thing about this. I can't click this and move it up like you'd think you'd be able to. You can't. So on that MASH node, come on the MASH 1, this is where you create everything. I'm going to go to my transform here and add a transform node. And that creates a transform node. And then I'm just going to take the position up 0.5. And that will set it right on the ground. So it's different, but it has its reasons of why it does that. Okay. So now all that does, all the first part does, is create the dynamic, or the boxes in their shape. Okay, similar to me duplicating inside Maya, and then duplicating and scooting them over. It's same thing. It's all it's done, except now we have this 3D cube. So now I can go here under Dynamics, and I can add a Dynamics node. Now this is what's kind of neat about this is it's more live, like the system we had before. If I wanted to change how many of those I had, I'd have to go back and redo it. But with this one, I don't. I can just go back to that distribute node, change my numbers here, and it will automatically update my dynamics, which is a pretty awesome system. All right, so here is my ground here. It automatically puts it like 20 units below. If I hit play, okay, and you'll actually see that as it's falling, and the other system would do this too, as it's falling, it's actually like kind of coming apart a bit. And then when it hits, it's doing that. Okay, so that's just a part of the settings that we have here. So under my collision shape, I'm going to set this to box. Okay, doesn't really help it a lot. Let's see, mass. Collision jitter, if I set that down to 0, let's see, if I set my damping, yeah, everything else should be good. Yep, there we go. It was just that one, that collision jitter. Having that value up, it does that. Now, I actually may want a collision jitter in order for that to happen. In this case, I don't want this to happen. I don't want this. I actually want this to just stay right here like it was before. So I'm going to go to, when I made a dynamic, I get a MASH bullet solver, just like we had before. This one has a lot more. You'll see the other one stopped at 240. This one goes to 960. Now, 60 to 240, there wasn't a huge difference in speed. When we go to 960, it's going to calculate it more accurately, but at the cost of it actually moving a lot more slowly. Okay, so this is frame 66, and it's barely left the grid. If I set that back to 60, you'll see at 66, we're all the way crashed. Okay, so just stuff to keep in mind. Set it to 240. Typically, that's sufficient, and you'll see that it plays back pretty close to what we already had. Okay, so 240 is good. Collision margin is a thickness around the shape. So if this is set to, let's say, 5, then it'll probably explode when I hit play. Nope. Sometimes it will explode. Basically, it's kind of like a buffer to give them some room. Probably because they're all the same shape, it's not doing that. All right, so they've gotten rid of the restitution of the ground. So now it's just called bounce. Here's the position of it. So set that to 0. The hardest thing with anything dynamic is there's so many areas. So just kind of, if you're trying to figure out where it was, just kind of go through the tabs. Okay, here's the dynamics tab here. Is the button inside there? Or is it under the bullet solver? Is the button inside here that I want to play with? Okay, there's always stuff in different spots. All right, so let's rewind. Let's hit play. Okay, so here we are on frame, or I'm playing this at the very beginning. You'll see that he's stuck right at the beginning. Okay, because there's no momentum for him moving down, he doesn't break apart like he did before. So that's like perfect. Now let's go to create polygon sphere. And this is where it's going to be different. So I'm going to make this an active body just like I did before. Okay, nothing different there. And I'm going to rewind and I'm going to hit play. And you'll see that it just falls literally straight through. Even though this is a bullet object and that is a bullet object, they're dealing with two different solvers here. One is a MASH bullet solver, one is a regular bullet solver. So the two of them do not typically play nicely together. I'm going to go under the, let me delete this one. I'm going to go back to my bullet, or my mash here. I'm going to go back to my transform. I'm going to set this to a value of 10. And create a brand new sphere. There we go. And I'm going to click on my, get rid of this bullet solver. I'm going to go to the Mash bullet solver, and under here there's a collider object. So you can right click and connect, and then I think you can click on stuff. There we go. So I have to click the sphere, control click that, right click, and then say connect, and then it'll connect it. Or you can just middle drag an item into this box. That's typically what I do, is middle drag into that box. All right, so now if we rewind and we hit play, you'll see that it actually does collide with that sphere and fall apart. Okay, now it is pretty dramatic as to how it's doing that. Let's go here. There it is. So under the polysphere shape, under Mash, there is a bounce. So we'll take the bounce off. We'll take the damping up. We'll take the friction up. We'll take the mass down, maybe to 10. There we go. So now it's going to fall, obviously, a lot nicer than it was a second ago. Now, you may be thinking, okay, well, can't we just then animate this, just kind of like smashing into it? All right, let's try that. So I'm going to go back to my Mash, back to my transform, set this to 0.5 so it's on the ground. I'm going to set a key on here, go up to frame 50, set a key there, and let's see. Nope, it doesn't work. It's something weird with how they connect to each other, that it just doesn't want to play nicely like that. I don't know, and I'm still trying to work that part out, because this is new to Maya, that it even allows us to do that. Trying to get these dynamic systems to work is usually the worst part about any dynamic stuff, especially when you get into, you have cloth, you have hair, you have particles, you have Mash stuff, you have bullet, and there's other systems you can incorporate in there too. Sometimes they all don't want to play nicely together. So the way that we can get these to work together is if I create a sphere. There we go. And I put this on a Mash network. Okay, so there's a sphere. We get the same thing. We get a distribute. I'm going to go into the Z direction. There they are. I'm going to go into, I can go to offset 2. This is kind of a neat way just to kind of move that down. I can't move it up though because of just how it works. Like, I need the actual transform to do that. So I'm going to go to transform node. Set that to 1, 2, 3 is good. And then set this to 10, 20. Set that to 50. Okay. So now let's see if this will work. Let's go to Mash. Let's go to Dynamics. Add a Dynamics node. You'll see here that we have a Mash 2. And because we have Dynamics, it's still using this one bullet solver. So now, because these are under the same bullet solver, they will then interact with each other, as before they were not, because they were part of different solvers. Okay. So here's Mash 2. Here's Mash 2 Dynamics. So these are the spheres. So if I come down here to initial velocity, I go to the Z direction. I say -10. Just for having a similar setup, let's go to only one sphere. And let's hit play. All right, well, that's obviously way too slow. Let's go back to Dynamics. And if you're if you don't remember, you can do this. You can go to Copy tab, and you can actually just pull this out, and there's Mash 2 Dynamics that you can just move wherever. Like if you have it off screen. Uh-oh. I just hit everything. There we go. you can pull it off screen, and that way you can have it off there. That way it's always available, so you don't get confused by it. Let's go -60. Let's hit play. Okay, so now they're interacting with each other. Okay, and again, one of the cool things about this is that I could then say I'm going to have 3 spheres, and I could even have them in different heights. So I'm just changing the distance in Y too, so they come out at different heights. So then, boom, boom, boom. Okay, now here's where the Mash Dynamics has some extra stuff that the other one doesn't. I'm going to go back to Mash 1, which is my cube. I'm going to go to Mash 1 Dynamics, and under Constraints, I'm going to right-click and say Create. So now what this does is if I go to Wireframe, it's actually going to like connect these cubes together. Okay, let me hit 5 and then play again. So it's going to go a little slower. And you'll see that they're not breaking. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Mash 2, which is my spheres. Let's change the mass to 10. Let's change their initial velocity to -80. Hit play. So they're a little bit heavier now, 10 times heavier. And they're coming in faster, so fast that they've decided to not do anything at all, apparently. Yep, they're apparently just sitting there. That's weird. Oh, because their mass is heavier, then they're going slower. So let's take this up to -250. This is the stuff you have to think about because all of these things go into basically this huge mathematical formula as to how they all work together. And by changing one, you're changing the entire thing. So just stuff to always be on the lookout for. Like, what did I just change? Typically, you don't want to change 10 things at one time because then that gets screwed up in the system. All right. Let's rewind that. All right, let's take this up like 1,000. Okay, good. All right, so now let's go back to our bullet solver. I want to take the friction up on the ground and the bounce off of the ground. There you go. All right, so let's also go back to Mash 1 Dynamics, take its bounce off, take its friction up. And we haven't really adjusted any damping or anything. This is just like straight out of the box. I could also lower its mass. That way I won't slow the balls down by adding more mass to them. It'll just lower the mass of these items. Whoops. So now you'll see that the boxes are actually like connected together, which is a awesome thing. Now I'm going to go back to Mash 1. Yes. Here's where that constraint is. I'm going to double click it. And right now it's set to glue, and it's not set to breakable. So I'm going to make this breakable. And now watch. There we go. So now they can actually be broken apart. And what's cool about that is that some of these will actually be like full-blown pieces. And what's neat too is that they'll actually, like, if they hit the ground at certain spots, like that one just did. We'll see if we can see that again. Right there, where it's like breaking apart. Let me get myself some more frames here. Also, when you do dynamics, you have to make the sound effects, otherwise it doesn't make sense. Breaking threshold. So the lower this number is, the easier it is to break. So 0.05, they just all break. Set this to 10, the default's 2. Always remember defaults. There you go. It's much more difficult to break these things into pieces now because of how they are. Okay, now ideally what you'd want is something like this, and then as it hits the ground, it just like shatters, like that one did. Sweet. Okay, so that's glue. And then this is also connecting nearest. Okay, so there's other ones you can play with. Right now I just want to give the basics. Let me get back to that. Mash 1, constraint. Okay, so connecting the nearest is this cube is searching for items which are 5 units from it and connecting to those. So if I set this to 1 and rewound, you'll see that there's nothing connecting it because there's just not anything that close. If I set it to 1.5, it'll start to connect stuff. Now it'll connect to, this one's connecting to that one and this one and that one and all the cubes around it. So you get this kind of neat pattern. You could also set the maximum number of constraints. So let's say I did 2. That way they're kind of locking themselves into certain spots. Okay, so they're not going to be connected to everything. They'll just be connected to certain ones. Or 3. You can also look at connect touching. So if they are touching each other, they will connect at that spot also. And again, you can set the number of maximum constraints for something like that as well. Connect a point. This is a single point that it connects to. So like right here on the ground, it's locked to that. Okay, so watch when I hit play this time. You can see that the base of this does not move. Okay, the base pretty much stays where it is. And the rest kind of fly away from it. They break off. So that's typically one I'll use for doing like structural type things. You can do it to an offset point, meaning that you give it a specific point, like, there you go, like over there. So just for fun, yeah, nothing. Like I said, the one I typically use is that connect to point or connect to nearest or touching. You can also do connection masking, which is like creating an actual mask which will control it. So let's say I had a specific design I wanted to break out of this. I could make a mask that said, you know, these are all connected and these ones are not, and then you go away. Okay, cool. So let me save this one as a mash one. Mash. Okay, now benefits of one versus the other. So the benefits of the bullet menu here is that we can add pretty much whatever item we want to add to this. I could make my own custom shapes and add this to that. Under the mash one, you're locked to using the same shape. As far as I'm remembering or visualizing this, I've tried a few different things. You're locked to the same shape, so I can't have different shapes here that would then all connect together. Now, the disadvantages of using this one is that once I create this shape, I'm locked into that shape. If I want to redo it, I have to undo and then redo and then make it all work again. With this one, I can go to, with the mash one, I can just go to my distribute and, oops, let me go to my mash one. There we go. My distribute here, and I can just make, you know, let's say I made this distance 20, 20, and 20. And then I filled this in. Remember, one more than that. Okay. I set that to 1 on accident, but I'm actually happy that I did that, because if I set that to 20 also, just so you can see, 21 times 21 gives me 441. So that's 441 cubes. And then if I did it again, it'd be 9,261 cubes, all trying to calculate dynamics for, which Maya would incredibly slow down. It's possible, it's just going to slow down. But you can see how quickly I'm able to do that. Let's take the Y distance to 0. Oops, not the Y distance. You're a fool, Sean. The Z distance to 0. There we go. All right, so then we hit play, and you see very quickly this animation happening. Okay, and because all these other items are kind of locked to that area, the other items will not move also. Okay, so again, it's pretty neat how that works. You can't do that with this bullet system. It just doesn't work like that. So for doing something very straightforward like this, same shape, blah, 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 I'll use mash. If I'm using more specifically design shapes, I will use bullet menu button for that. Now let's give a, let me save this again. Now let's give a more practical example of using that. So I'm going to go to, ignore the lady up there. I'm going to go to Creative Crash or High-End 3D. They renamed it again. And download this DG Voroi Pi 1.0 for Maya script. Okay. So create a login, download the script. You should already have one if you've ever downloaded anything from there before. And then you will extract it into your Maya scripts folder. And then you will call it by using this name. So you may have to reboot Maya. We'll find out. DG. I spelled it wrong. Hold on. Documents, scripts. Oh my gosh. That's what I want to call it with. Isn't that what it's called? DG Voro PY UI. Yep, I probably forgot the brackets. I did. I also added a Y. All right, cool. So I'm going to use this script. Okay, so this is a practical example of using bullet. So I'm going to use a random shape. So let's say a torus. Make it big. I'll set it on the ground. Let's say this is 10, so this would be 5. Okay, now in order to use this, I need particles. So I'm going to go to my FX menu. I'm going to go to N particles and create particles. Create emitter. There we go. So I'm going to create an emitter. I'm going to use the regular legacy one. It doesn't matter. It just gives me less stuff. I'm going to use a volume one, and I'm going to choose, because I have a torus, I'm going to use a torus. Okay, it doesn't matter. I just need particles. That's all it is. Okay, and I'm going to scale this up to the same dimensions as the other one. Okay, so all this is doing is creating particles. So I'm going to hit play. Okay, and that makes particles. So if you look there, you can see the purple dots. Those are all particles. The more particles I have, the more pieces I have. So for the sake of this, I'm going to keep it pretty simple. Okay, so let's just say I play it that far. Okay, so I take these particles whenever I'm happy with where they're at, and I say particles to locators. Okay, so that's what the script does, is it'll actually take my particles right here, and it'll actually make locators out of them. And if you remember what locators are, they're these little plus sign things. Okay, so we don't really need particles for this. We could simply create locators and move them around, and that would be sufficient as well. But that would be a hassle to do. Literally in 2 seconds, I made all of those. Okay, so I'm done with the particles. I'm done with the emitter. I can delete them. See how simple that is. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shape here. I'm going to take my locators, and I'm going to say Voronoi Shatter. Now, I probably selected in the wrong order. Probably did. So let's grab this, and then grab the locator group. And there we go. So now what this is going to do is it's going to try, at least, to build that shape using this Voronoi script. And what it does is, if you search for there we go. So what it does is it's a locator here, a locator there, a locator here. So it's like connecting all these locators together in order to figure out where the pieces should break and creating the shapes in between them. So what you get is you get these shapes. You can literally take whatever shape you want, and it'll break it up into all these tiny pieces or as many pieces as you want. There you go. That's a good example. Okay, so here's a shape. There's a shape. The more locators you have, the more shapes you're going to get. Now, a disadvantage of Maya versus other programs is that Maya is doesn't have this built in for some reason. I don't know why. It'd be great if they did, but they don't. So other programs like Houdini and Cinema 4D actually have this built in now, so you could do this whole process simply by clicking on shatter, and it'll simply make a shatterable object. Now the particles that I had 358 locators, so it's making 358 pieces here. Some of these pieces may not work. Okay, we're just going to accept it regardless of what comes out of it. Typically, it doesn't work. If I do this once or twice and it still doesn't work, I'll typically jump into RealFlow with my geometry, break it there, and then bring that geometry back into Maya. And you can do this in levels too. So I could actually break this into, let's say, 10 pieces, then grab one of those pieces and break that up further, and then grab one of those pieces and break that up further. Again, it's in Maya, it's a manual process. In RealFlow or Houdini or some of these other ones, it's very procedural. It's just kind of like dragging sliders and adding shaders where you want more stuff to happen. Unfortunately, Maya hasn't caught that up yet. There is, if you look under the effects here, there is 3 shatters, solid, shell, and crack, I think it is. Those are pretty useless, so don't even try using those because you will not get anything desirable. This will create a solid shape that is breakable, and that's what's awesome about this Voronoi shatter. There's also a plugin while we're waiting for this. It's called DMM, Dynamic Molecular something. That's not it. But what it does is you grab an object and you say this is a DMM object. And what it'll do is it'll keep it as a solid object until it starts to break away, which is really nice because sometimes you'll see with this kind of setup how you would still have that shape of here's where it's broken, where with DMM you don't get that. Okay. Now the more realistic you want your break to be, the more stuff you have to build. So if you wanted to break a wall and there's like, a steel metal beam behind it and there's wires behind it and there's whatever else, you need to build all of those things. Cool. All right, so that looks like it's done. Close that window, hit 5. Yep. So you can see how it's definitely not nice and crisp and clean, but it'll do for what we're showing off. All right, so I just hide those locators. Here's my shapes. If I go to my modeling menu and I change my stuff to soften edge, sometimes that will help. It does not appear to be helping in this case, and actually made this piece look even worse. I'll set that back to 30. Okay, so let's see how we can break this shape up. So I'm going to go under my effects again, go under bullet, go under rigid set, and call this donut. Oops, before I get that far, I have to make sure of a couple things. One, I have to make sure that I grab the pieces and not the whole shape. Okay, so I can't just grab the group, that doesn't work. I have to grab this piece or all these pieces like this, so I can make sure I grab them all. And number 2, I have to make sure that their pivots are centered. So I'm going to say modify free center pivot. There we go. That would have been a lot of undoing. All right, so just center pivot it, make sure you grab all the pieces, and make it a donut. Okay. So now I rewind it. Now when I hit play, it's going to explode. Okay. So the reason it's exploding is with every dynamic object, it tries to be as optimal as possible. So if I go to that donut initial state in here, and I go to the collision attributes, every single one of those pieces is being calculated with a box around it. Okay. So if there's a let's just say a pyramid, instead of it calculating cone, there we go. Okay, instead of calculating like this point and these points along the bottom, it basically just makes a cube around it, and that's what it's using to calculate. So we don't want Maya to do that. We want Maya to actually use the pieces of geometry. So if I change this to hull, that will do it. Here's that collision shape margin. I also have to set that to 0. Then I rewind, then I hit play. Okay, and you'll see that it'll behave as a donut. Perfect. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I'm going to leave it as a donut. I'm going to go to my initial conditions, and I'm going to say initially sleeping. Now what that means is when I hit rewind and I hit play, it'll just not move at all. Okay, it's not going to move until something else interacts with it. So if I were to grab a cube, there we go, and I went to active body, I said, yes, you are dynamic. Yes, your collision shape is a box. I don't know why they don't say cube, but whatever. And then just like before, we gave it some initial velocity, this time in the negative x direction. Okay, spin around. I can see that the positive x is going left. I don't want it to go left. The negative x is going right. That's the way I want to go. I hit play, and it misses it. Negative 60. Okay, now the second that it hits it, it becomes a dynamic object. So you'll see that it hits it, bounces off, and then just falls straight down. So if I go to my mass and obviously crank that up some, and then I go to my solver and turn the ground plane on, and turn my initial frame rate up to 240, okay, you'll see that it starts to break apart. Now, it's the second it hits it, let's just pretend that this doesn't hit it at all. We'll just set this down here. Oops. Sorry. It does need to hit it because I need it to become active. We'll just set this back to 1. There we go. So it hits it. Now, everything becomes dynamic on it, so everything just falls straight down. Now, what I want to do is I want to glue all the pieces together so that they don't do that. So, again, you're always going to be bouncing around between 15 different menus, so just get used to it. I'm going to grab the donut. I'm going to go to the donut initial state. I'm going to say glue shapes. Here's that same threshold. Here's the maximum constraints. We don't have the same options that we had before, but we have some. Oops, let's rewind. Let's take that threshold up some. There we go. Okay, so now it holds the shape, which is what we want. Now we just need to add a bit more mass to this. So let's say 500. And one piece falls off. All right. There we go. Sweet. So now you see that I broke that piece into a bunch of tiny pieces. And then we could still play with our damping and whatever else. Now, this really works well when you don't have a rounded shape like this, inside of Maya, at least. If we were to go inside and make a cube, like a building or something, it works really well for that because it's pretty straight. So we wouldn't have to worry about any of these rounded surfaces, which is why we get these weird shapes. Sweet. Let's go take that initial velocity up to negative 80. Now you can also do some angular, which is rotation. So I'm going to do negative 150 here in the Z. Sweet. Alright, so now let's save that scene. Bullet. Dynamics. Donut. Alright. So then what we want to do is, let's say that we're satisfied with everything that we have here. We want to render this out. So, under our bullet, I want to grab the shape. So I'm going to grab the donut. I'm going to go to bullet. I'm going to say, I'm sorry, not bullet. I'm going to go to, did they move it out of here? It was in here at one point. There it is. Export all to Alembic. Okay, so I'm going to export all of this to an Alembic. Donut animation. Hit save. It says ABC Bullet plugin is not loaded. So I go back to here, to my settings and preferences and my plugin manager. Make sure ABC Bullet is loaded. Okay, try that again. Donut. Alright, so then what it's doing now is it's writing out all of the information. Now any UVs, textures, stuff, whatever, I want to do that all beforehand, before I get into doing all this. There we go. What else? Anything else that's inside here? I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, everything else is good there. Alright, so let me just save this. Okay, so I'm going to go to a new scene. Now, when we did a export all to Alembic, we have basically a cached out version of what we want to do, or what we have. So I'm going to go to cache Alembic, and I'm going to import that back in here. And as long as it worked, which didn't look like it did, let's go back to it. That's why we always save. I'm just going to grab everything inside here. Bullet, export all to Alembic. Yeah, 5 megabytes, that should have been everything. It plays it, so I'm not sure why it didn't write everything out. But what it should do is basically create a locked-in version. Because what could happen is, let's say we wanted to play, render this out with motion blur. We couldn't do it because when you go to motion blur, it'll go to frame, let's say 50, and it'll go from 50 to 51. And then it jumps back to 51, and then goes to 52, and then 52 to 53. And so it's always jumping back and forth. So if I were to do that here, you can see how this is creating some really weird behavior. Alright, so let's try that again. Don't need to save that. Back to cache. Import. How big is this one? Still 5 megs. Alright, nothing comes in. It's very odd. Alright, so we'll just do the regular Alembic export. So knowing Maya, they just broke something. Or I don't know what I'm doing. Either way, we'll just try something different. Time slider, step, yes. This one gives you more options anyway. So especially for things like UV writing, you want to make sure you have that. Holy verbose. I believe that's all I want to do. Donut. Okay, so this one's 86 megabytes. Should be it. There it is. Alright, so we get, here's the bullet solver, which is nothing. We can just delete that. Here's our locator group. We don't need that. Here's our torus shards. We do need that. Here's the original torus. We may want that. Here's the original cube. We don't need the front camera. Here's donut solved. Here's perspective cameras. We don't need that. Okay, so let's see. Alright, so now let's hit play. Alright, so this one is just the group without anything in it, so we'll just delete it. Here's our original torus. We can delete that. Alright, so now we just have the essentials of what we have in the scene. We don't need this. Apparently we do need that locator. Okay. So now we could assign materials to it. If you had your UVs already laid out, everything would still be happy. There we go. And then because this is a cache, you see how I can just move back and forth. And it plays the same way every single time. Sweet. So that is a introductory to Bullet, which is one of the dynamic systems that's inside Maya. Amazing, amazing stuff. It is a lot of fun once you get over all the stupid stuff of it. Just being able to break stuff is super awesome. And then you could do other stuff too, depending on how complex you want to get with this, is that you could actually have like little smoke cloud dust particles kind of flying off all of these pieces too, which is really cool. And then just for fun, let's go here. And we're under Arnold. We're under motion blur. We don't have a light in the scene. There we go. So now we get some nice motion on here. Motion blur. Sweet. Cool. So have fun with that.